about David Blight, or maybe a few words of praise about David Blight. You all know, I think, a lot of his background. You know his many books, his many awards. But there's a few beautiful, huh?
That's enough. That's enough.
Now I want to talk about your 7 years in Flint.
Oh, okay, good.
David was a history teacher at a high school in Flint, Michigan, and he still is devoted to teachers and the work you do. It's amazing to me how he's such a scholar of history. He's actually 187 years old. It would have been impossible to do what he's accomplished in a normal life otherwise. David,
I'm actually in a nursing home here. We don't have any COVID cases yet. So.
Oh, good. Oh, good. But David not only studies
very bad joke.
Yeah. David not only studies the past, but he really believes in the future, and that's why he supports teachers. Because you're training the kids who are coming up. And that's all I'm going to say about you, Mr. Blight, but thank you again for doing this. And now let me turn the screen over to Professor Blight.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I'm not muted here. Is everybody back? I guess everybody.
Yeah, and if everybody could just mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Somebody's got a big flower bouquet down here or something. I don't know what that is. Anyway, well, welcome to all of you. Thanks for doing this. It's already been said, I was a high school teacher myself back in the day. I have to say, I never did this, though. I mean, we couldn't even imagine this then. Teaching online. I think we're all right now, to some extent, sort of citizen teachers. There's a certain civic responsibility almost by sustaining what we call school, or universities and colleges in my case, when no one's here. You know, I've been joking with colleagues, what if they gave a school or a university but nobody could come? You know, well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach out by the only means we have. I want to do just a few things here, and I don't want to take too much time. I'm going to start with a Douglass quote, which is what I have a tendency of doing, that I hope will make us feel something about the moment we're in right now, as well as his. This comes from the midst of the Civil War. It's February 1864. It comes out of Douglass. It's a famous Douglass speech. I count it like one of his 3 or 4 most important. It's his speech called The Mission of the War, where he makes this prolonged argument about the nature and significance of the Civil War as what he called the national regeneration of the United States. In other words, it's destruction and remaking. But note how he uses the term hopeful. He says, the most hopeful fact of the hour is that we are now in a salutary school, the school of affliction. If sharp and signal retribution, long protracted and overwhelming, can teach a great nation respect for justice, surely we will be taught now and for all time to come. You know, Douglass is always there to look up some passage of wisdom and ideas on almost anything. To me, he's a little bit like Walt Whitman in that sense. Whitman had something to say about everything. And so did Douglass. We're in a salutary school now. We're in a pandemic. We're in a total economic collapse. We're in institutional freefall. And we're in a clear political crisis, the end of which we don't know yet. That's quite a menu right there. Is this going to be a salutary school of affliction that we learn from? Which is, by the way, the ancient definition of tragedy. Is tragedy that which we learn from, or is tragedy that which we simply die from? We don't know yet, do we? We don't know where this ends. When this is over is something we're all saying every day, but nobody knows when it's over. I'm getting ready for all the rebirth metaphors. They're going to start flowing. We're going to be doing rebirth metaphors all over the place. some of which you'll probably agree with, and some of which you won't. So my next op-ed piece, if I can get the juices spinning, is going to be about the uses of rebirth metaphors. But anyway, that's to come. But this guy Douglass, just a quick overview, because some of you know Douglass well, as I just found out in my small session, and some of you may not, because I know you come from very different kinds of schools and disciplines. He's born a slave in 1818 out on the eastern shore of Maryland. He lives 20 years as a slave until he escapes from Baltimore in 1838. He lives 9 years as a fugitive slave in New Bedford, Massachusetts, in Lynn, Massachusetts. His freedom is purchased for him in England by his British anti-slavery friends, and only after he has his legitimate free papers, he comes back to America in 1847, a very angry young man, I might add, because he had just experienced a kind of a flowering while he was in England for 18 months. He was treated like a kind of young conquering hero. He spoke to huge audiences in Ireland, Scotland, and England. He was by and large free of the kind of racist resistance he experienced in America constantly. At any rate, he's then going to, of course, go on in the late 40s, early and into the 1850s to become one of the great political abolitionists, not just an orator, but a newspaper editor for 16 years. And by political abolitionist, that means he became an advocate of the use of political action, the use of political organization, the use of newspapers, and the use of voting, which was extremely important to Douglass. He, of course, has a major role during the Civil War, at least as an advocate, as the moral voice of the cause of emancipation. And then he's going to be one of those rarest of leaders or reformers. He's the old radical outsider, if you think about it. Always on the outside of power, beating on the doors, trying to get in, but experiences the victory of his cause in the middle of his life. He's in his 40s at the time of the Civil War and emancipation. And in a real sense, had no right to really believe he would live to see emancipation. But he does. So what happened? The old radical outsider, always on the outside, beating on the doors, trying to get in, when he begins to get his toes a little bit inside of power, a little bit inside the Republican Party, and then eventually a little bit inside the bureaucracy of the federal government with 3 appointments in the federal government. Marshal of the District of Columbia in 1877, Quarter of Deeds in the District of Columbia by the early 1880s, which may not sound like a great sexy job, but it was an important job. He was like a sheriff of the district, and it paid a salary, which was extremely important for him and for his family. And then eventually the US minister to Haiti. What happens to an old radical outsider when he becomes a political insider? What kinds of deals and compromises might he make with principle? The Douglass that writes this Composite Nation speech is the Douglass of the immediate post-war moment. We think he first crafted this speech that you all just read in 1867. The text you've read comes from 1869. Now, I'd like to just spend just a few minutes going through the speech, just some highlights of it. You've all read it, and I've already heard some great insights from my small group. But what makes this speech so remarkable is, well, many things do, but especially it's its hopefulness. This is not the Douglass you read in the 4th of July speech of 1852. It is not the Douglass of the old abolitionist. This is not the Douglass, the Jeremiah, always warning and chastising his people, chastising his country, demanding that his country somehow live up to its creeds, admiring the creeds and hating the practices, or worse. This is not the Douglass of condemnation. It's a Douglass suddenly saying the United States is a new thing. The United States has been reinvented. It has been remade, its constitution rewritten, its vision reimagined out of the colossal bloodshed of the war and the revolution of the emancipation of 4 million slaves. And now, in this speech, he's even imagining, that maybe the United States ought to export these ideas. It ought to export its abolitionism. It ought to export its egalitarianism. The world is sort of waiting for America's new vision, or so he thinks. He becomes almost, it's startling when you read it. First, he becomes almost overnight a kind of a soft imperialist. He's gonna advocate the annexation of Santo Domingo in 18, and he's part of Grant's commission. Actually, he wasn't a commissioner, he was just the secretary of the commission that went to Santo Domingo to try to negotiate the annexation of what today we call the Dominican Republic. But mostly this speech at times reads like, I liken it to a sort of diversity statement, of any American school, college, or university today. It reads like, the mission statements of schools these days, or it reads like a multiculturalism manifesto of the 1990s, which were happening everywhere. And we still do multiculturalism manifestos. But this was done 150 years ago. Here is this vision of American pluralism that is going to be made probably more famous by some writers like Randolph Bourne, W.B. Du Bois, William James, especially at the turn of the 20th century and the early 20th century. This vision, not just of a melting pot America, but a genuine nation of pluralism, all peoples gathered under a set of creeds that can somehow make democracy. Idealistic, sometimes people would call this naive. Well, lots of people in the world thought it was naive. It's one of the reasons fascism became so strong in the 20th century. But here's this vision, fashioned in 1869, at least in this version of it, in this text, that nevertheless in the middle, and by the way, I just wanted to stop on a couple of things. And I'm sure you may have underlined this, but note when I think it's about the third page in, I don't know what pagination would be here on whatever version you have, but it's where he stops and actually defines what a nation is. I'll quote it. He said, a nation implied a willing surrender and subjection of individual aims and ends, often narrow and selfish, to the broader and better ones that arise out of society as a whole. It is both a sign and a result of civilization. That's about as good a modern definition of what a nation becomes as you're going to find. It's very similar to Benedict Anderson's famous definition of a nation as a imagined community, but that doesn't come until the 1970s. And it's also Douglas in that section. Douglas is also saying, a nation is its story. A nation is the story it tells about itself. It's the story it comes to believe in. Can you have a nation without a story that its members believe in? Probably not a very unified nation if you don't have a story to believe in. This is Douglas imagining that story is now actually possible because of emancipation, the victory in the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and note that the text of the 1869 edition of this speech comes out the very year they voted through the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Amendment. This is a speech that owes its very arguments to the three great Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, which is the remaking of the US Constitution. And furthermore, I would just add that you also have here, as some of you pointed this out in my small session, this speech is full of Douglass's faith in the natural rights tradition. The idea that human beings are born. They don't have to earn these rights. They're born with certain natural rights. And he names them. There's a point at which there's a quote where he says, "A government founded upon justice and equal rights of all men." He says, this reinvented United States can be this, of all men, claiming no higher authority for its existence or its sanction for its laws than nature, reason, and the regularly ascertained will of the people, steadily refusing to put its sword and purse in the service of any religion, creed, or family. What he's just done there is he's named 3 of the 4 first principles of the Declaration of Independence. The one he left out was equality there, but he takes care of that one other places in the speech. But he has named natural rights, popular sovereignty, and separation of church and state. He says that's what America has a chance to be now. And then, of course, in the middle of the speech comes sort of a surprising, rather robust argument for Chinese immigration. And many of you may know this history, but the Chinese immigration was just then in the late 60s and particularly in the 1870s becoming a big national issue. The first Chinese Exclusion Act didn't come until 74. That was an exclusion act only against Chinese women. And then the full Chinese Exclusion Act came in 1882. But this issue of Chinese immigration into California, into the West Coast, and then into across the country was becoming a very big political issue in these years. And here's Douglass making the case back in 1869, basically saying, isn't he, America, wake up, get ready. They're coming, and it's a good thing. They're going to bring their civilization. They're going to bring their knowledge. They're going to bring their centuries of wisdom. At some point, he even talks about their flowers. I don't know. He says, come on, get ready. They're coming. And he has that metaphor at one point about they're coming across the mountains, they're coming across the rivers, they're coming across this and coming across that. Just get real. And he even at one point, did you note, he puts himself into the mind of the white anti-immigrant, and he speaks in their voice as a way of doing kind of satire of them. Are white people not the owners of this continent, he says? Is there not such a thing as being more generous than wise? Where have you heard that? In the effort to promote civilization, may we not corrupt and destroy what we already have? Yeah, he embodies that voice of the anti-immigration sentiment as a way of sort of showing its bankruptcy. And that's where he then declares migratory rights as human rights. You don't see the human rights language too much in the middle of the 19th century. There's some of it. Abolitionists had always tended to prefer the 18th century language of natural rights. Human rights, some people argue, is not really part of our broad conversation until the Declaration of Human Rights after World War II. But there's a lot of human rights talk in the 19th century, and here is some of it. Anyway, lastly, I would just say, it's hard to read this speech and realize again that it's 150 years ago. And this vision that he's putting forth here, it's hard to read the speech and not ask, so how are we doing with this now? Why are we having such a hard time now? What's so different? In a piece I wrote about this for The Atlantic, I wondered out loud whether, at this time, the controversial immigrants were coming from China and Italy, and I suppose to some extent still Ireland, and then eventually in the late 19th century, Russia and Eastern Europe. Today it's wherever, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and so on and so on and so on. But the issue's the same. And then he ends by basically talking about nature and how nature, makes all humans not the same. He never comes out and says, all people and all cultures are just the same, but that they share a nature. It is this speech, I think, and here you could please push back and ask and critique anything you want. It is an assimilationist model. His vision here is an assimilationist model. These Chinese are going to be, they're very different. They have alien gods. They have alien languages. They have strange practices. They huddle together a lot and all that stuff. But he says they will buy in to our creeds. That's pluralism. That's not melting pots. That's not taking away from people who they are or what they are, but it's saying there is a way to be composite when one is different. These are such basics of the world you all teach in every day. It's almost like at times in this speech he's speaking off some posters that are probably up in your school. I don't know. But you have to remind yourself this is 150 years ago. I don't know how exactly to use this speech. I've talked about it many places. I've written about it. One way I can think to end my little bit of this is that, my goodness, we are all craving some kind of rebirth now. I mean, basic practical rebirth out of our, our hiding, our isolation, our captivity into real life. That's one kind of rebirth. But we need a larger, whatever we is in America anymore, we need a larger rebirth. We need a political rebirth. We need a rebirth of imagination. I don't know precisely how it comes, but we've been given a crisis here, given or encountered a crisis here that we had better make the best of, or it probably will crush us. I also came, and I think I'm going to stop there. I also came with a whole list of ideas about all the crises that Douglass himself faced in his life, crises that at times all but crushed him, but it didn't quite crush him. Actually, in a few cases, I think they did crush him, but he just got himself back up again. But I don't see a necessary purpose in doing that right now. I think it'd be much better if you all just fired back at me or talk with each other, or as we did in my small group. I've already heard about 4 great insights into this speech and how people might actually teach, if not the speech itself, at least the ideas in it. So,
thank you so much. Yes, let's turn the floor over for questions. If you would use the little raise your hand function, we'll just call on you as the questions come in.
there's always your real hands too. You can just wave.
Not quite every, oh, there we go. All right, Alan, let's have you pose your question.
Thank you for doing this, Dr. Blight. I had the benefit of having you for Frederick Douglass class, GLI PACE. I'm getting my master's right now.
All right, that online course last year.
Yeah. So I jumped at the chance.
I think you were one of the frequent questioners in that one too, weren't you?
Certainly for one Q&A. You gave me great resources.
Go ahead and say you were. No one will know. That's all right. Go ahead.
So for that class, I worked on the collaboration he had with the English-Irish plight. Kind of earlier, and when I read this, I was also struck. You mentioned about putting himself in the mindset of, the white anti-immigrants. The nativists.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that time in England, and obviously he came out of it with English friends as well as and admirers who purchased him actually, and Irish admirers. But I feel like he was so gifted in his ability to transcend just what was happening to him.
Yeah, he was not always perfect at that, to say the least. And don't leave the Scots out, by the way. He loved Scotland. He had a lot of Scottish friends too. But yeah, he had a great sympathy with what he saw in Ireland. He saw the very beginnings of the famine, the Great Famine. He arrives there in 45. He's in Ireland till early 46, and he was already seeing starvation. And it really had an effect on him. However, he did not like it when I will say, he didn't like it when Irish abolitionists would get up and say, we are enslaved just like, the American blacks are enslaved. Douglass would often object to that and say, no. Chattel slavery is a different matter. However, he did say he'd never seen poverty, starvation like he saw in Ireland, and he was only there at the very beginning of the famine, and then in that first 18-month tour of the British Isles, he did not go back to Ireland. Yeah, he gained a great sense of empathy, I think, from that experience by meeting all these Irish, Scottish, British abolitionists, by understanding a different culture. It's actually several different cultures. He fell in love with the English Romantic poets. He really learned a world he could never have otherwise understood. But the effect it really had on him was giving him this personal experience of being genuinely respected, genuinely admired as a human being by the very people he was speaking with, living with. That was a very new experience for him. However, some of you I'm sure know this, he was not always perfect on these issues. Douglass was eventually very fond of his Irish jokes, which sometimes were pretty ugly. He tended to love the Irish he met in Ireland, but not so much the Irish in New York, because they had some terrible tangles. He would make jokes about if drunken Pat could hobble to the polls and vote, why can't a sober black man like me? That didn't always go over well. He was not always on the right side of the ledger in his attitudes toward Native Americans either. So there are blind spots and holes in this, and he could sometimes fall into some very common 19th century stereotypes, ethnic and racial stereotypes in his views. But like for anyone, world travel and encountering new cultures changed him. It changed him a great deal.
Thank you. Ariana, do you want to jump in with the next question?
Sure, definitely. Although I think some of what you were just saying, Dr. Blight, is maybe part of the answer. But thank you so much for being here. I guess what I'd like to know is what your perspective is on why his views on Chinese immigration differed from those of other African Americans at the time.
Oh, well, part of it could be, I don't know, that's a good question. That'd be an article to try to investigate and write. Part of it may be that by then he'd had two fairly profound international experiences. He goes back to England again and Scotland in 1859, escaping after the John Brown raid. Whereas some of his other fellow black leaders and black abolitionists had not gone abroad as much, although some of them had too. Are you referring to anybody in particular who had a distinctly different view of Chinese immigration?
No, I'm just basing it off of there was like a little introduction to the article we read that mentioned.
Right.
No.
Well, there was always competition about work and labor. That always concerned people. That would be an interesting thing to explore, though, if there is a broader kind of African American leadership point of view, or multiple points of view, about Chinese immigration. Chinese immigration was a huge and controversial question by the 1870s and 1880s. Huge. You know, all kinds of terrible cartoons. Well, I mean, brilliant cartoons about it, some of them depicting terrible situations. The uses of Chinese labor in the railroads and mining and so on is a horrible labor story. But I don't know. I don't know the views of a wide variety of other Black leaders about this. I probably should have explored that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kevin, would you like to jump in?
Sure, thanks. Professor Blight, I was wondering about who the audience was for this particular speech. Like Douglass seems very attuned in both his writing and his speeches about who is in front of him and who might be reading his work. I was wondering who was the audience for this 1869, or if it was earlier, the earlier version of it.
Yeah. We know what the audience was for the 69 speech. He gave this at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., where he spoke many, many, many times. And eventually he had his own pew there at Metropolitan AME. So that would have been a largely Black audience, though not entirely. A lot of white folk went to these AME churches sometimes when he spoke in them. So that was the audience that particular day. I was saying this, I think, in our small group. I have not been able to find examples of him giving this speech after at least the early 1870s. And I suspect, I can't be sure, but I suspect the reason is it no longer fit the political environment. As Reconstruction was in retreat or in defeat, or increasingly in defeat by, say, 1873 on, this speech didn't make the same sense anymore. And he's on to many other kinds of topics, many other kinds of urgencies. So I don't know much. There are other Douglass speeches that he gave endlessly. I mean, just literally hundreds of times. And there you have to simply say he had every kind of audience you can imagine. I mean, the post-Civil War Douglass, I don't know how much he did it with this speech. I don't think very much. But the post-Civil War Douglass did annual lecturing tours year after year after year. And he tended to do them in the winter. Brutal winter lecture tours of 3 to 4 months. He would speak on an average of every other day. He would go on these tours and give as many as 60 speeches, sometimes 70, over a period of 4 months, day in, day out, riding by train. And he would carry several speeches with him. He almost always had the self-made man speech. Some years he would try out a whole new speech just because he knew he needed something new, because he's sometimes going to the same venues out in Wisconsin or Iowa. And, he didn't want to say the same thing he said last year. And he also says many times that he got tired of just telling his own story. That's kind of what people wanted to hear. Fred, just tell your tale, but he got tired of doing that. But the Composite Nation speech, I can't find him giving it anywhere after like 71 or 72, which is interesting. It just vanishes from his repertoire. But the audience that day was the big AME church in Washington.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Giovanna, would you like to jump in?
Thanks. I was curious about how you opened your conversation with us about how his speech was so hopeful and sort of coming off of the high of all those Reconstruction amendments that you described, and in particular, the 15th, and how with the passage of the 15th also came a split, right? Or at least that's how I've been talking to my students about it with Douglass and his friends in terms of women's rights, and how that then may also connect to the Page Act that you were describing, and maybe how those, I don't know if there's a connection between those timelines in terms of immigration, conversations towards the Chinese being focused exclusively towards female immigrants. And I don't know, it seems sort of like an interesting confluence of events.
Oh, it is, and you ought to teach it that way. It could have been Douglass's way of deflecting some of the controversy of the women's suffrage issue. Frankly, I don't know that for sure. I don't have real evidence of that, but yes, in 69 and 70, he gets into a terrible tangle with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony and a few others among the women's suffrage leaders, because women were not in the 15th Amendment. It was a bitter conflict. In fact, it became an openly racist conflict, especially Anthony and Stanton using rather brutally racist language, attacking some Black leaders, namely Douglass. The problem with that issue, of course, was that if women's suffrage had made it into the 15th Amendment, it never passes. It simply would not have passed. You never get that out of the U.S. Congress in 1869, which is all men, if you put women's voting in it. It just wouldn't happen. Everyone knew that. But some leaders of the women's suffrage movement, who've been at this all of their lifetimes, which is worth remembering, just weren't patient anymore at all. But yeah, it's the same historical moment. And he doesn't, in this speech, address that I recall. He does not make even a nod. I mean, he's probably including women in all of his natural rights expressions, because he did. Douglass was completely a women's rights man. He was from early on. The only Black abolitionist to speak at the Seneca Falls Convention, and so on. Masthead on his newspaper was "Right is of no sex or color." So, but he does not make a nod to it in this speech, and politically at that moment, he really couldn't. He was too much on the defensive about it because he was under attack. But it'd be interesting to research this a little bit and see how it may have come up in the Chinese immigration debates.
I'm grateful for the hopefulness, that tone, and sort of trying to imagine Douglass in this heady time where these amendments are passing one after the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we're always looking for a little hope here and there, especially if it's based in something. But it's worth remembering here, Douglass initially opposed the 15th Amendment. He thought it was way too limited. Right. He also even was really annoyed, angry about the 14th Amendment because it was full of compromises, as all great legislation is usually full of compromises. Douglass sort of, I would say he hated the 15th Amendment because the 15th Amendment comes out with the most conservative possible version of it. I don't know if you know that. There were 3 different versions debated, fiercely debated, for the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. The one that gets passed is the most conservative of the 3. It just says, everyone shall have the right to vote, every male shall have the right to vote. It cannot be denied the right to vote based on race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. There was a second version that would have eliminated qualifications tests, meaning literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all this stuff that will be used later. They were already anticipating that. There was a more radical version of the 15th. Then there was an even more radical version that would have a very simple statement. I wish I had it in front of me. I might. It was in my lecture yesterday. Yeah, here it is. Here it is. It just happens to be here. Sorry. The third one would have simply said, all male citizens 21 years of age and older have the right to vote, period. Now, they left out women clearly. Now, and it still had to be enforced. But anyway, he hated the fact that the most conservative version of this is what got passed. But after it was passed, he went to Baltimore and marched in a parade to celebrate the 15th Amendment. Douglass did this all his life. You work like hell, you beat on the doors, you risk your life, you demand as much as you can get. And then when you get the half loaf you get it out and you do the best you can with it. That's not a good way of putting it. What he really became is a kind of hard-boiled, radical pragmatist who learned how to use the best achievements possible for change. And that's what the 15th Amendment was. Anyway.
Did he ever revisit the ideas in this speech to lament the fact that they didn't happen, or any? Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. In fact, many times, but especially, I mean, one place to look for that is a big speech he makes and some things he wrote in the North American Review after the Supreme Court decision of 1883. It's known as the civil rights cases. It was the kind of final coup de grace of the Reconstruction era Supreme Court decisions that in effect muted at best and all but ruined the 14th Amendment, at least for that generation. That the civil rights cases of 1883 were based on discrimination cases from around the country. There were 5 of them. Most of them were about access to public facilities. And the Supreme Court simply ruled in 1883 that any violations of that kind could only be adjudicated at the state level in a 9-0 decision of the Supreme Court, which was as much as saying the 14th Amendment means nothing. And his speech in the wake of that was full of despair about how the victories, and it's full of, it's full of the language of how the victories of emancipation have now been blunted. It is as if Lee had won at Appomattox, and so on and so on. It's like all that we have won is now potentially defeated. Even in that speech, though, he does what he usually does. He finds some way to fashion some kind of hope onto the end of the speech, and the hope that he fashions onto it is the faith in the natural rights tradition, which you just read here.
Yeah.
He even does that in his lynching speech at the end of his life. He finds a way to keep hoping even when he's talking about lynching.
Well, thank you very much. At this point, we will prepare to go back into some small groups, but we would like at the Academy of Teachers to thank first those of you who joined us by live stream today. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. And for those of you who are here with us on Zoom, we will put you back for about 13 minutes